For 28 years, the world believed that Margaret and her four friends vanished forever on a stormy September night in 1979. Some said we were dead. Some believed we ran away with men. But the truth is more horrifying than anyone could ever imagine. I am Margaret. I am 70 years old. And today, for the first time after nearly 3 decades of living in the shadows, I will reveal the real reason why 5 young women had to climb over the factory gates in the dead of night and disappear from their old lives forever. This is not a story of broken dreams. This is a story of the devil hidden behind a respectable reputation, of dark secrets concealed by money and power, of 5 women who paid with their lives to escape hell. If you're listening from anywhere in the world, please leave a comment and subscribe, because there are truths that need to be spread no matter how they may shake what you believe. There are stories, however painful, that must be told. And this story will change the way you look at trust, at power, and at the price of truth. Prepare yourselves, because what I am about to reveal has been buried for far too long. Since I was a child, I was always a reserved person, preferring to observe rather than speak. My mother used to say I had a keen insight, able to see beyond the obvious. Perhaps that's why I was the only one who noticed the dark events unfolding in that textile factory, the only watchful eye that noticed the shadow casting itself behind the friendly smiles and company picnics. I started working at Henderson Textiles at 16, right after high school, moved by a desire to help support my family and build a future. In the early years, I found exactly what I was looking for. The factory routine provided me with comfort and security, giving every moment of the day a purpose and a connection to something bigger than myself. The other girls became my family, united by the same dreams. There were only 5 of us in the quality control department, supervised by Mrs. Dorothy Henderson, a strict but fair woman who'd worked her way up from the factory floor. Millbrook was a small town where everyone knew each other. The factory, situated on the edge of town, was the lifeblood of the community. Nearly every family had someone working there. It was in this context that I met Mr. Charles Whitmore, who arrived as the new plant manager when I was in my 5th year at the factory. He was a tall, imposing man with a voice that commanded respect in every meeting. At first, everyone admired him. He brought in new contracts, modernized equipment, and promised raises for everyone. But soon I began to notice unsettling subtleties. Prolonged glances, questions during one-on-one reviews that overstepped the bounds of what was necessary, touches on the shoulder that lingered longer than acceptable. Small gestures that added up revealed a disturbing pattern. What I discovered next would shake everything I thought I knew about the place where I spent 10 hours a day. I realized I wasn't the only one who felt uncomfortable. Linda, a young woman of only 19, also began to avoid being alone with him. The atmosphere in the quality control room changed, and joy gradually gave way to an oppressive silence laden with secrets and omissions. Mrs. Henderson fell ill around that time, a victim of severe arthritis that eventually forced her into early retirement. Without her protective presence, our department became vulnerable. And it was precisely during this period that the shadow I had been sensing transformed into something much more sinister and terrifying. Mr. Whitmore began to visit our department more frequently, using his authority to put us in uncomfortable situations. I clearly remember the first time I witnessed something truly serious. I saw Linda cornered between the supply shelves and Mr. Whitmore in the storage room. He was holding her wrist tightly while her face reflected fear and shame. That night, I couldn't sleep a wink. Thousands of thoughts swirled in my mind. Deep down, I knew something profoundly wrong was happening, something that went against all the principles that had motivated me to work hard and build an honest life. I tried to talk to Betty, desperate for an ally. At first, her response was silence, a wall built of shock and fear that I understood all too well. For days, she seemed paralyzed by the horror of it all. However, as the initial shock subsided, her sharp, methodical mind began to take over. The silence gave way to quiet, pointed questions. She started connecting details I had missed, and it was she, not I, who finally broke the stillness one evening by whispering the one word that could save us. Proof, the discoveries I made shook me to my core, generating horror and indignation. The situation was not an isolated event, but a systematic practice, coldly planned and executed with cruelty. Faced with this, I understood that it was imperative to act, as true courage does not submit to injustice. But what I was about to do would put all of us in danger beyond anything we could imagine. Genuine courage compels you to confront evil even when it presents itself under a mask of respectability. However, I did not imagine that this resolution would radically transform the course of my existence, leading to a disappearance that would last 28 years. I would be forced to give up everything familiar and dear to me, undergoing an irreversible metamorphosis. Henderson Textiles was like something out of a Norman Rockwell painting, with its red brick walls, its tall windows letting in natural light, a meticulously maintained lawn, and a small break room that became even more charming in the early morning hours when mist settled over the town, creating the illusion of being in some quaint New England postcard. Our routine was simple and methodical. We would clock in at 7 o'clock a.m., check the production schedule, and then each of us would dedicate ourselves to our responsibilities. My main duty was quality inspection, making sure every bolt of fabric met Henderson standards, in addition to training new employees. The repetitive work provided me with a sense of deep connection with purpose. Ruth, with her 65 years of experience, was in charge of the finishing department. Her attention to detail was legendary, nothing got past her eagle eyes. She used to say, "We take pride in every thread that leaves this building." Betty was our problem solver. She dedicated hours to figuring out machinery issues and improving processes. She had an admirable memory, with an impressive ability to recall technical specifications. She always repeated, "Efficiency is its own reward." Carmen radiated happiness. She was dedicated to organizing the company's social events and charity drives that everyone loved. Her favorite phrase was, "A grumpy worker is a lousy worker," pronounced with a contagious laugh. Linda, the youngest among us, was still learning the ropes, having arrived only 6 months prior to these dark events. Shy and gentle, we had bonded while working the night shift together, sharing a comforting silence. Mrs. Henderson was our pillar, a firm and demanding figure, but with a generous heart. Her maxim was, "Standards without heart is tyranny, but heart without standards is chaos." Little did we know that our safe haven was about to become our prison. Our life was dedicated to honest work and community. In addition to our factory duties, we volunteered at church fundraisers and local charities. Henderson Textiles was respected and recognized as a cornerstone of Millbrook's economy. It was in this atmosphere of simplicity and trust that the shadow began to creep in. Mr. Patterson, our previous manager for many years, retired to Florida. He was a kind man who treated us almost like a grandfather. We were saddened by the news of his departure, but we understood he'd earned his rest. Shortly after, Charles Whitmore arrived from the corporate office in New York. I clearly remember the first day I saw him at the all-hands meeting. His presence dominated the space, and his voice resonated through the factory floor, strong and clear. Something about him caused me an inexplicable discomfort, but the other workers seemed positively impressed. On his first week, he brought gifts, donuts for the break room, a new coffee machine, and promised quarterly bonuses. During the first performance review, his questions deviated from the usual and became more invasive. He showed interest in details of my personal life, questioned my relationship status, asked about my social life outside work. His visits to our department became increasingly frequent, always with some excuse. He needed to check production numbers, had questions about quality standards, or wanted to see if we needed anything. Every time he came, a somber atmosphere accompanied him. I began to observe patterns in his behavior, like the way he sought moments of privacy with the younger women, the intensity of his gaze, and the way he used touch. His touches were seemingly casual, a hand on the back, adjusting someone's collar, standing too close, but they weren't casual at all. One day, Linda dropped her inspection clipboard on the ground just as his voice was heard approaching. Her hands were trembling so much that I had to help her. "What did he do to you?" I asked when we were alone. Her only response was to cry while saying that he had cornered her in his office, claiming she needed special mentoring. He'd threatened her, saying that if she complained, no one would believe her word against his, and she'd be fired and blacklisted from every factory in the region. What happened next would force me to make the hardest decision of my life. I tried to talk to Mrs. Henderson before she retired, but she was outraged by my insinuations and told me I was being dramatic, that Mr. Whitmore was sent by corporate and was beyond reproach. The situation worsened after she left. He began to act more boldly, as if he were sure he wouldn't be reported. I was a witness to the suffering on my coworkers' faces, especially Linda's, who was wasting away with each passing day, losing weight, showing up with dark circles under her eyes. The situation reached a critical point when corporate announced an extended audit period, meaning Whitmore would have even more control and oversight. It was then that his mask of professionalism fell completely. One night, working late, I found Linda huddled in the ladies' room, her uniform disheveled and a reddish mark on her neck. "No one will believe me," she murmured, adding that he had locked the office door and said she needed to show her dedication to the company if she wanted to keep her job. That night, I understood that we were completely alone, that no one would come to save us, and that we would have to find a way to escape that nightmare ourselves. The walls that were supposed to protect us now imprisoned us along with our torment. And the man who was supposed to lead us had revealed himself to be a predator. It was imperative to do something, and I, the silent observer, would have to take the initiative. Have you ever felt that fear that paralyses the soul? That makes your heart beat so hard it feels like it's going to break your ribs. I felt it constantly after realizing what was happening. After Mrs. Henderson's retirement, Charles Whitmore proved to be cunning, knowing how to behave so as not to arouse suspicion in front of several people. The truth I was about to uncover would change everything and put us all in danger. He appeared proper in meetings, professional during factory tour, but when he managed to isolate one of us, his inner demon manifested. I began to realize that he created situations on purpose, scheduling individual meetings at the end of shifts when most workers had left. Linda, I need to discuss your performance in my office after closing. Margaret, stay behind to go over the monthly reports. Poor Linda was the one who suffered the most, very young, supporting her sick mother. She was too vulnerable to defend herself. I witnessed on several occasions how he pressed her against the filing cabinets, how he spoke too close to her face, how his hands accidentally touched parts of the body that no manager should touch. One evening, I found Linda huddled in the storage room, trembling and adjusting her uniform. He says he's helping my career, she whispered, adding that she must cooperate with him and that if she told anyone, she'd lose everything, her job, her reputation, her ability to care for her mother. My blood boiled, and for the first time I felt true hatred. I hugged Linda and promised to protect her. But how? Who would believe the word of factory workers against a corporate-appointed manager with impeccable credentials from New York? I tried to talk to Betty. We have to do something, I said. Betty sighed and asked what I suggested, saying that no one would believe us as a manager's word was worth more than ours, especially one sent by the head office. What about Mrs. Henderson? Even retired, she has influence. Mrs. Henderson is sick, and even if we could reach her, she made it clear she thinks we're exaggerating. The company will protect their investment. The situation deteriorated further when Carmen also became a target of his attacks. Carmen, always so cheerful, began to become quiet, lose her appetite, and her eyes were now constantly red from crying so much. What we discovered next would force us to make a choice that would change our lives forever. One afternoon, she finally broke down in sobs, telling me that Whitmore had called her for a performance review and began to interrogate her about her personal life, her dating history. The moment I tried to leave, she recounted, he grabbed my arm with such force that he left a bruise. He said I was too friendly with the male workers and needed an attitude adjustment. Something inside me broke. Seeing Carmen, once so vibrant, reduced to that state, it was as if he were annihilating her very essence. I started to pay more attention and make plans to protect the others. I tried to make sure none of them were ever left alone with him, inventing tasks that had to be done in pairs. However, he noticed my actions and began to isolate me, spreading rumors among the other departments that I was showing problems with cooperation, that I was stirring up trouble trying to form a union. Ruth from finishing began to watch me with suspicion. She approached me one day and asked, Margaret, is it true that you've been badmouthing Mr. Whitmore? My desire was to scream the truth, but I was aware it would be useless. She would never believe me over him. He was management, I was just a worker. It was then that I understood that words would be insufficient and that I needed proof. I began to observe and meticulously record every detail. Dates, times, his words, and his actions. I kept a journal hidden in my locker, documenting everything. One night he crossed all boundaries. Linda came to the boarding house where several of us lived, trembling so much she could barely stand. Her face had finger marks and her uniform was torn at the shoulder. He tried, she whispered, in his office after hours. He locked the door. He said it was what I owed him for keeping my job. He said no one would believe me anyway. The anger I felt was unlike any other emotion I had ever experienced. This ends today, I declared. The next morning, under the pretext of a dental appointment, I took the bus to the Regional Labor Board office in the county seat, a task that required me to use a sick day. I waited for 3 hours until they could see me. What happened in that office would seal our fate and force us into hiding. When I finally went in, I felt my courage waver, but thinking of Linda and Carmen, I found strength. I recounted everything, presented my notes, described the incidents, and explained how Whitmore used his authority to intimidate us. The investigator, a middle-aged man with tired eyes, listened attentively in silence. When I finished, he sighed heavily. Miss Margaret, these are extremely serious accusations. Mr. Whitmore comes from a prestigious family. His father is on the board of directors. Are you absolutely sure about this? My heart sank. Despite all the evidence, doubt still lingered. I am absolutely sure, I replied firmly. I fear for the well-being of my coworkers as long as he continues to have unrestricted access to us. I'll look into the matter, but I have to warn you, cases like this rarely go anywhere. It's your word against his, and he has powerful friends. You might want to consider finding employment elsewhere. Sometimes that's the best solution for everyone involved. I left with a mixture of hope and apprehension. I had done everything in my power within the system, though the investigator's words haunted me. 2 nights later, Whitmore showed up at the boarding house where Linda, Carmen, and I lived. His face was contorted with fury. He pounded on the door until the landlady let him in. He stood in our common area and announced loud enough for everyone to hear, "I know what you did, Margaret, filing false accusations against me. The labor board called the company, and I've been fully exonerated. They know you're a troublemaker trying to extort money from the company." He remained there, intimidating us for almost 20 minutes. When he left, he whispered as he passed me, "You'll regret this. All of you will." I was in shock. The labor board had revealed everything, including who had filed the complaint. Betty came to my room that night. "What have you done, Margaret?" "He's threatened to fire all of us now. He says you're a liar trying to destroy his reputation, and anyone associated with you will face consequences." The walls were closing in, and we had only one choice left. I tried to justify myself, but Betty shook her head. "Mr. Whitmore has convinced the plant supervisor that you have mental problems, that you're making up stories because he gave you a poor performance review. Corporate is backing him completely. They want you gone." Reality hit me full force. Not only had they believed him instead of me, but now all of us were being punished for trying to expose the truth. "It's not fair," I murmured. "He's hurting us." Betty sat on my bed, dejected. "Life isn't always fair, Margaret, especially for women like us. We're replaceable. He's not." The next day, I was called to the office. Mr. Whitmore was already there with the plant supervisor. With barely concealed glee, they informed me of my immediate termination for insubordination, filing false accusations, and attempting to damage the company's reputation. In that instant, I understood that justice was unattainable for us within that structure. It was then that I made a decision that would transform my existence forever. I would not leave town quietly. I would find an alternative, even if it meant disappearing with the others who wanted to escape. "We are going to leave," I declared to my companions that night, "to flee." The mere mention of that word echoed ceaselessly in my mind. Day and night, that word haunted me: escape. I never imagined that one day I would be planning to flee from everything I knew. Yet there we were, 5 frightened women whispering in the boarding house basement, surrounded by old furniture and boxes. Betty, always thoughtful, expressed her hesitation. "If we run, we'll look guilty. They'll say we had something to hide, that maybe Margaret's accusations were just a distraction from something we did wrong. And we do have something to hide," Carmen replied bitterly. "We have to hide our shame, our humiliation, the fact that the system has abandoned us. What we were about to do would make us fugitives, but staying would destroy us." Linda just sobbed quietly, hugging her knees. "I can't go back there. I can't face him again. I'd rather disappear." Ruth, the eldest, remained silent for a long time. 65 years, she said finally. "For 45 years, I've worked in textiles. I thought I would retire with dignity from Henderson. However, now I realize that sometimes survival demands sacrifices we do not understand. If it is necessary to leave to protect you younger girls, then so be it." Her words solidified our decision. We would flee together. But how could 5 women with limited resources, no contacts outside Millbrook, and no direction accomplish such a feat? The boarding house was surrounded by a tall fence topped with decorative spikes. The front door was visible from the street, and our landlady kept odd hours. Even if we managed to leave unnoticed, where would we go? We needed outside help, someone we could trust. I prayed as never before, not reciting memorized prayers from childhood, but expressing the deepest feelings of my soul. "Lord, if we are doing the right thing, send us a sign." And he sent it in the most unexpected way. Tom Miller, the delivery driver who brought fabric supplies to the factory, a simple man of few words and calloused hands, who lived alone on a small farm on the outskirts of town. I'd known him for years. He was quiet, reliable, and always kind. That week, as I was clearing out my locker after being fired, he approached me in the parking lot. "You don't look well, Margaret," he commented in a low voice. I was surprised because Tom rarely said anything personal. "I'm fine," I replied with a forced smile. "Just lost my job, but I'll figure something out." He continued to watch me with concern. "Forgive my prying, but my late wife used to say I had a gift for sensing when people are in serious trouble. If you or the other girls need help, you can count on me." My heart sped up. Was this the sign I had been waiting for, or a trap? "What makes you think we need help?" I asked cautiously. He sighed deeply. "My younger sister worked at Henderson 20 years ago. She also had problems with a manager, different man, same story. By the time she finally told me what had happened, it was too late. She'd already—" He trailed off, his eyes darkening with old pain. "She took her own life. This stranger's tragedy would become our lifeline." I felt an immediate connection with this man who carried his own grief. "You're right," I confessed. "We need help." A lot of help. In the following days, Tom became our secret ally. We exchanged information discreetly when he made deliveries to the factory before I was fired, and afterward, through notes left at a specific tree near the boarding house. In one of his notes, he told me about a section of the back fence near the boarding house where the posts were rusted and loose. "There's a wooded area right there," he wrote. "My truck can wait on the service road that runs behind the properties. No streetlights, no traffic after 10 p.m. It was our only viable path. A plan began to take shape. Tom had a cousin in the mountains of West Virginia who owned a small motel. The cousin, Jake, had agreed to take us in temporarily with no questions asked. Tom would use his savings to finance our journey and the initial period of adjustment. "I can't stand by and watch you go through what happened to my sister," he declared when we met secretly one evening. His eyes were filled with tears. "She deserved better. You all deserve better." The plan was simple, though full of risks. We would escape on a night of heavy rain when visibility would be poor and people would be less likely to be out. Tom would wait with his pickup truck on the service road. We would have to slip through the damaged section of fence and make our way through the woods to meet him. However, before anything else, it was essential to gather what we needed. Betty managed to retrieve our personal documents, birth certificates, social security cards, from our rooms without arousing suspicion. Carmen gathered the little money we'd saved. Linda and I took care of packing essentials, aware that we couldn't take much as it would be too obvious, but leaving meant abandoning everything we'd ever known. Tom got us plain clothes from a thrift store we needed to blend in, to look like we were heading anywhere but away from trouble. The hardest part was deciding what to leave behind. My grandmother's ring, Betty's collection of books, Carmen's record collection, Linda's hope chest she'd been filling for her future wedding, Ruth's photo album spanning decades. We had to travel with the bare minimum. "Only what is strictly necessary," Betty reminded us with tears in her eyes as we sorted through our belongings. As the appointed day approached, the fear intensified. What if we're discovered? What if Whitmore finds out? "We can still back out," I suggested one night. "Maybe I can just leave town alone and you all can stay, say you had nothing to do with my accusations." "Don't even think about it," Carmen interrupted me. "If one goes, we all go. We're in this together." That same evening, we heard a knock at the door. Someone was coming to see us. We froze in fear, but it was just Ruth, who'd been staying with her niece since being laid off after my firing. "I know what you're planning," she said bluntly as she entered our room. My heart pounded. We were lost. To our surprise, Ruth took money from her purse. "Take it. It's all I've saved from my retirement fund that hasn't been spent yet. Let it help you get started wherever you're going." I was momentarily speechless. "But why?" I managed to ask. "You didn't even believe us at first." "I always suspected something wasn't right," she confessed with a sigh. "But I was afraid. I'm too old to start over, too tired to fight. I'm a coward and I've been one my whole life. But you girls, you're young, you're brave. You deserve a chance to escape this hell and build real lives." Her words gave us the courage we needed for what came next. In that instant, I understood that we were not the only ones who had suffered, that perhaps there had been others before us who had been silenced or broken. I hugged Ruth tightly. "Come with us, it's not too late." She wiped her tears. "For me, it is too late, but I will pray for you every day. Now go, before I lose my nerve and try to talk you out of it." The night before the escape, I couldn't sleep. I reflected on my family, my hometown, my dreams of a simple life working honestly. Were we making the right decision? "If we are doing your will, Lord," I pleaded in prayer, "please protect us and guide us to safety." The next morning, Tom left a note at our designated drop spot hidden under a rock near the oak tree. "Tonight at midnight, storm coming, be ready." The rest of the day passed in a whirlwind of suppressed nervousness. We went about our usual activities. Carmen went to her new job at the diner. Linda stayed in her room claiming illness. Betty visited the library one last time, and I walked around town saying silent goodbyes to everything familiar. At midnight, when the church bell tolled 12 times, resonating above the sound of the rain hammering the roof, we changed out of our everyday clothes and into the plain outfits Tom had provided. I looked at my companions, almost unrecognizable without our usual styles. We were no longer factory workers from Millbrook. We were women fighting for our freedom, our dignity, our very lives. We slipped out through the basement door of the boarding house. The rain soaked us in seconds. Carmen carried the bag with our documents and money. Linda had a small satchel with medications and first aid supplies. Betty had managed to grab one small box with our most precious photographs. Every step we took was a step toward either freedom or disaster. The fence was right where Tom said it would be rusty posts that wobbled when Betty tested them. Together, we pushed and pulled until we created an opening just wide enough to squeeze through. I went first, tearing my jacket on a piece of metal but making it through. Then Carmen, then Linda, then Betty, and finally, with great difficulty, Ruth. She was slower, her joints protesting, but determination burned in her eyes. In an agonizing moment, her coat caught on the fence and I feared she'd be stuck. But then Linda freed the fabric and Ruth tumbled through to the other side, breathing hard but victorious. And then we ran, 5 women splashing through mud and rain, branches whipping our faces, hearts pounding with terror and hope. The woods were dark and treacherous, but we pushed forward toward where Tom had said he'd be waiting, and he was there. Our sole support in the whole world was waiting with his old pickup truck parked on the service road, engine running, lights off. 3 people squeezed into the cab while Carmen and I climbed into the covered truck bed, hiding under a tarp among bags of feed and farm equipment. And so we left, leaving behind the factory, the town, and the life we knew. At that moment, we couldn't imagine the extent of the journey that awaited us. We had no idea that our disappearance would cause such a stir, that we would be intensely searched for, and that our names would be dragged through the mud. We didn't know that we would spend 28 long years living in secret, pretending to be people we weren't, carrying an impossibly heavy burden. But in that moment, as the truck pulled away into the darkness, we felt something we hadn't felt in months. Hope, the first safe haven the night of September 17th, 1979, was deeply etched in my soul. The torrential rain turned the dirt roads into rivers of mud. The thunder drowned out the sound of our labored breathing and the uncoordinated rhythm of our racing hearts. In a few hours, we went from being respectable working women to fugitives on the run. We abandoned our identity, our purpose, and the entire life we had built in Millbrook. The truck swayed violently on the muddy roads, and Carmen and I were thrown against each other under the soaked tarp, trying desperately not to make any noise. The silence was broken only by occasional whimpers that we quickly stifled. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only an hour, the truck slowed down. I felt my heart race, fearing we were being stopped, that someone had seen us, that the police had been called. But then I heard Tom's voice, calm and reassuring. "We're here, ladies, you can come out now." I lifted the tarp and realized we were in a barn. The walls were weathered wood. There were tools hanging on rusty nails and bales of hay stacked high. The characteristic scent of animals and earth filled the air. "Where are we?" I asked, helping Carmen climb down from the truck bed, both of us stiff and cold. "It's an old barn on my property," Tom explained, helping the others out of the cab. "We're about 30 miles from Millbrook, and nobody comes out here except me. You'll be safe for a few days while I make arrangements." The place was simple but clean. In a corner there were cots with blankets piled on them. A makeshift table held cans of food, jugs of water, a battery-powered lantern, and a small kerosene heater. We had made it out, but our journey was just beginning. "Tom," I began, emotional, but he just shook his head and squeezed my shoulder gently. "Rest now. I'll be back tomorrow with more supplies and news about the next step. There's a lock on the inside of the door. Use it. Don't open it for anyone but me, and I'll knock 3 times, then twice, then once. That's how you'll know it's safe." After he left, we looked at each other. 5 soaked women shivering from cold and fear in an unknown barn, wanted by law, with nothing but each other and a desperate hope that we'd made the right choice. Ruth was the first to break the silence. "Let's thank the Lord for helping us escape, for sending us a friend in Tom, for keeping us together and giving us this shelter." We formed a circle, holding hands, as we had done so many times during breaks at the factory, gathering to celebrate birthdays or holidays. But this time there was no cheerful break room or cake, just us, our sincere prayers, and a God who seemed to have heard our pleas. After the prayer, we began to organize the small space. Betty distributed the cots and blankets. Carmen checked that everyone was okay, especially Ruth, who seemed exhausted and was coughing from the cold rain. Linda and I organized the food supplies and lit the lantern and heater. As we ate some crackers and canned soup heated on the small camp stove Tom had left, the silence returned, each of us lost in our own thoughts about what we'd left behind and what uncertain future lay ahead. "What are we going to do now?" Linda finally asked in an almost inaudible voice, her hands still trembling as she held her soup. "We'll go to Tom's cousin's place in West Virginia," Betty replied with more confidence than I think she felt. "There we'll figure out the next step, we'll find work, we'll build new lives. We can't live on the run forever," Carmen said softly. "Eventually we have to settle somewhere, don't we? One day at a time," Betty said firmly. "First we need to get far enough away to be safe, then we'll worry about tomorrow." That first night in the barn, I slept very little. Every noise startled me awake, the wind rattling the barn door, an owl hooting, the settling of the old building. Each time I was certain it was the police, that they'd found us, that Whitmore had sent people to drag us back. What we didn't know was that our disappearance would make headlines. I woke to the smell of instant coffee. Ruth, always the first to rise despite her age, had figured out the camp stove and was preparing weak coffee with the supplies Tom had left. "Good morning, Margaret," she said, smiling as she offered me a tin cup of steaming coffee. I slept like I haven't slept in years. No alarm clock, no factory whistle, no fear, just peace. That simple sentence struck me like lightning. It was true. Despite the danger, despite sleeping on a cot in a barn, for the first time in months we had slept without the constant fear of what Monday morning would bring, what Whitmore might do next. One by one, the others woke up. We shared the coffee and some bread Tom had packed, waiting anxiously for his return. He arrived around noon, bringing more food, dry clothes that actually fit, and news that made our blood run cold. "The factory is in an uproar," he said gravely. "They discovered you were all gone early this morning when you didn't show up for your shifts. Whitmore is furious, claiming you all escaped because of theft. He's saying money went missing from the company safe and you five are the prime suspects." "What?" Betty's face went pale. "That's a complete lie. Are they looking for us already?" Carmen asked, her voice shaking. "Yes, the police have been notified. They're searching the bus station, the train depot, checking with cab companies. They've got your pictures from employee files posted around town. But nobody's thinking to look this far out. They figure you'd try to get to a city fast. The lies being spread about us would haunt us for decades." It was then that he revealed more details of the plan. His cousin Jake would come to pick us up the next day with a furniture delivery truck and take us to his motel in West Virginia, where we could stay for a few weeks while figuring out our next moves. "You need new names," Tom said seriously. "New identities, new stories. You can't tell anyone you worked at Henderson Textiles. You can't mention Millbrook. You have to become completely different people." Betty took out a piece of paper and began to write with a pencil Tom had brought. "We need to agree on a story. Who are we? Where do we come from? Why are we together?" In the following hours, we created our new identities. We decided we would be cousins from Ohio, a family that had lost everything when our family business went bankrupt and were starting over. I stopped being Margaret Hayes and became Linda Peterson, a 24-year-old bookkeeper looking for work. Linda became Emily, my younger sister who'd worked as a secretary. Betty and Carmen became our cousins Catherine and Rose with various office skills. Ruth became our Aunt Millie, who had raised us after our parents died in a car accident years ago. It was strange to rehearse these new identities, repeating the new names, the fabricated story, until they almost became real in our mouths. We practiced introducing ourselves, talking about our fake past, supporting each other's lies until they felt almost like truth. Tom also brought civilian clothes, regular dresses, and slacks, nothing like what we normally wore. I hadn't worn anything but my work uniform and church dresses for years. Wearing those new clothes was surreal. I looked at myself in a small, cracked mirror Tom had propped against the wall and almost didn't recognize myself. My work uniform had become part of my identity, a badge of honest labor. "These new clothes made me look like a stranger." "You look different," Carmen commented, studying her own reflection. "Younger somehow, like a different person entirely." I swallowed hard. In Millbrook, we'd been known, respected members of the community. Now we were nobody, with nothing, starting from scratch with lies as our foundation. The weight of what we'd lost was crushing, but going back would be worse. The second night in the barn, anxiety about the future consumed me. We were no longer just fugitives from Whitmore's abuse. We were about to become completely different people, living under false identities, always looking over our shoulders. I woke up before dawn, startled by a nightmare in which Whitmore had found us. In the dream, he was dragging us back to Millbrook in chains while the whole town jeered at us, calling us thieves and liars. I left the barn quietly and sat on an old milk crate outside. The sky was clearing, stars still visible, a thin line of light on the horizon promising a new day. It was then that the full weight of what we had done fell on me like a physical blow. We had abandoned entire lives. We had become criminals in the eyes of the law, not for anything we'd done wrong, but for daring to escape abuse and speak truth. We'd left behind families, friends, our good names and reputations. Tears began to stream down my face. They were not tears of regret, but of grief for all we had lost and would never get back. "Margaret," I heard Linda's soft voice behind me. She'd followed me out. "Are you okay?" "I don't know," I replied honestly. "I keep thinking about my mother. She must be so worried. And we can't even tell her we're safe." "I know," Linda said, sitting beside me on another crate. "I keep thinking about my kid brother. He's only 12. What's he going to think happened to me?" "I'm scared," she confessed after a moment. Scared we'll get caught, scared we'll never be able to go home, scared of spending the rest of my life as Emily instead of Linda. Me too, I admitted, but staying would have destroyed us. You know that, right? What he was doing. It would have broken us completely. I know, she whispered. It's just so hard. We sat in silence for a while, watching the sun come up over the trees. Do you think God still hears our prayers? Linda asked quietly, even after everything. After we've lied, after we've run away, after we've become different people. In that moment, I had to find faith for both of us. God doesn't live in factories or town squares, Linda, I said, choosing my words carefully. God isn't impressed by employee ID badges or tax returns. God is here, I continued, pointing to her chest, and here, I concluded, pointing to my own heart, and He understands what we've been through. He understands why we had to run. Suddenly, we heard the sound of an engine. We both tensed, but quickly recognized Tom's pickup truck, and next to it, a larger delivery truck with Miller and Sons furniture painted on the side. This is my cousin Jake. Tom introduced us to a burly man with kind eyes and a thick beard. He'll take you to West Virginia today. The truck's for furniture delivery, so nobody's gonna question it on the highway. You'll ride in the back, hidden among the furniture, Jake explained in a deep voice. It ain't comfortable, but it's safe. We've got blankets and cushions back there. Should take about 5 hours if traffic's good. Are we ready? I asked, looking at each of my companions, aware that it wasn't just about physical preparation, but emotional readiness for the complete transformation of our lives. Betty looked determined, her jaw set with resolve. Carmen seemed convinced she'd made the right choice despite the fear in her eyes. Linda looked terrified but brave. Ruth appeared calm, her faith providing her with peace that the rest of us were still searching for. We climbed into the truck, settling in among boxes and furniture wrapped in blankets. Tom embraced each of us before closing the doors, his eyes wet with tears. "May God protect you," he said with emotion. "You are the bravest women I have ever known. You deserved better than what that place gave you." The doors closed, plunging us into semi-darkness. The engine roared to life, and we began to move. There, holding the hands of Linda and Betty in that cramped space, I felt a strange mixture of dread and relief. Dread of the unknown future stretching before us, relief for finally being free of Whitmore's shadow. We stayed at Jake's Motel for almost 3 months. It was a quiet, isolated place called Mountain View Lodge, ideal for those who didn't want to attract attention. The few guests who passed through were mostly truckers or traveling salesmen who stayed for a night and left without much conversation. Sarah, Jake's wife, treated us with a silent respect, never prying into our situation even though she must have known something was seriously wrong. One afternoon, as I was helping her change linens, she took my hand and said quietly, "I know you're running from something serious. I don't need to know what it is. I just want you to know that you're safe here as long as you need to be." Those words filled my eyes with tears. It was as if someone truly understood our suffering without us having to explain or justify ourselves. But we couldn't hide forever. Eventually, we'd have to face the world again. However, we were aware that we couldn't stay there indefinitely. The motel was modest, and we couldn't continue to live off the kindness of Jake and Sarah. Besides, our disappearance had become news that was spreading beyond Millbrook. They weren't headlines in major newspapers, but small articles in regional Pennsylvania and West Virginia papers and mentions on local radio stations. "5 women missing from Millbrook," said one. "Factory manager reports employee theft ring," announced another. I read these news stories in secret when Jake brought newspapers back from town, my heart sinking with each word. Whitmore was slandering us thoroughly, portraying us as thieves, troublemakers, unstable women who'd conspired to rob the company. The missing money he claimed we'd stolen was probably nothing more than petty cash he'd pocketed himself. It was in one of these news stories that we learned something that hit us like a punch to the gut. Mrs. Henderson, our former supervisor, had passed away, not from the arthritis that had forced her retirement, but from a heart attack shortly after learning of our disappearance and the accusations against us. We felt crushing guilt for her death, although we knew the real culprit was Whitmore and the system that had protected him. "We can't go back," Betty said firmly, her voice breaking. "Now they'll say we're responsible for her death too. That the stress of our crimes killed her." With the help of Jake and Sarah, we obtained new identification documents. "Don't ask how," they told us, "because there are things it's better not to know." Suddenly, we were no longer Margaret, Betty, Carmen, Linda, and Ruth. We were Linda, Catherine, Rose, Emily, and Millie, a common family with a common story of financial hardship. Jake had a connection in Cleveland, Ohio, a man who owned a small garment factory and needed seamstresses and quality control workers. The work was simple, sewing hotel uniforms and restaurant aprons, but it paid enough to support us. And most importantly, this man didn't ask questions about work history or references. So after 3 months at Mountain View Lodge, we moved to Cleveland, where we rented a small house in a working-class neighborhood, seeking anonymity among thousands of other struggling families trying to make ends meet. Adapting to our new lives was incredibly challenging. None of us were prepared for the customs of living as completely different people in a different city. Daily tasks that we'd taken for granted became complicated and anxiety inducing. Using a pay phone felt dangerous. What if someone was tracing calls? Taking public transportation meant being in crowds where someone from Millbrook might recognize us. Shopping at the supermarket required us to remember our fake names when the clerk made small talk. Every day brought new fears and challenges we'd never imagined. I remember the time we had to go to a bank to open a checking account for paying rent. The tension overwhelmed me so much that I almost fainted in the waiting line. My hands were shaking as I filled out the application with my fake name and fabricated social security number that Jake had somehow obtained for us. Betty, gifted with singular courage and a sharp mind, was always ready to face these challenges head on. She became our spokesperson, the one who dealt with landlords and utility companies. Carmen showed a natural aptitude for adaptation, quickly learning the bus routes and finding the best grocery stores. Linda, despite her youth and trauma, learned quickly, getting a second job at a diner to help with expenses. Ruth, for her part, strove valiantly, but the years and the stress were taking their toll. She moved slower, remembered things less clearly, seemed to age before our eyes. The work at the factory was exhausting 10-hour days hunched over sewing machines in poor lighting, but paradoxically, it provided us with some comfort. The repetitive movements of sewing had a calming effect on anxious minds, and for the first time, we felt we were actively contributing to our own survival rather than depending on others' charity. Little by little, we established a new routine. Although we had physically distanced ourselves from Millbrook and everything we'd known, our bond remained unshakable. Every night, we gathered in our small living room to share our day, to support each other, to remind ourselves why we'd done this. We couldn't go to church, too risky, too many questions about where we came from. But we prayed together every evening, not with formal pre-established prayers, but with intimate and sincere conversations with God about our fears, our hopes, our guilt. As time went by, months turned into years. Cleveland became familiar territory. The factory prospered and our salaries increased modestly, allowing us to move to a slightly larger house in a better neighborhood. We made some friends at work, always maintaining a certain reserve and carefully omitting crucial aspects of our story. The factory owner, Mr. Russo, recognizing Betty's talent for organization and problem solving, promoted her to production supervisor after 3 years. The salary increase was significant and desperately needed, especially because Ruth was showing signs of increasing fragility. Her hands shook, her memory failed, her health was declining. But just when we thought we'd found stability, tragedy struck again. It was around 1983 when we suffered our first irreparable loss. Ruth, Aunt Millie to anyone who asked, suffered a massive stroke while cooking dinner in our kitchen. When we found her collapsed on the floor, it was already too late. The paramedics said she died almost instantly. Her funeral was one of the most painful experiences of my life. We couldn't bury her as Ruth Martinez, the woman who'd worked at Henderson Textiles for 45 years and deserved recognition for her dedication and courage. We were forced to bury her under the name Mildred Peterson, an ordinary elderly woman with no history, no legacy, no truth on her headstone. At the cemetery, as the five of us became four, I made a silent vow to Ruth's memory. Someday I would tell the truth. Someday people would know what really happened, and Ruth would be remembered not as Mildred Peterson, but as the brave woman who gave up everything to protect younger women from abuse. After her death, we decided to move again. Mr. Russo was opening a branch of his factory in Charlotte, North Carolina, and offered Betty the manager position. We accepted immediately, seeing it as both an opportunity and a way to escape the grief that haunted our Cleveland house. Charlotte was a bustling, growing city where it would be easier to get lost in the crowd and blend in. However, we were also more exposed to news and information, which meant more risk of being recognized or discovered. Our life went on quietly through the 80s and into the 90s. I was beginning to believe that perhaps we had finally found peace, that we could live out our days as Linda, Catherine, Rose, and Emily, and take our secret to our graves. Then in 1994, I came across a newspaper article that made my heart stop and my hands shake so badly I dropped my coffee cup. The monster we'd escaped from was being celebrated as a hero. Millbrook factory manager celebrates 15 years of service, the headline announced. There was Whitmore, a little older, graying at the temples, but with the same hypocritical smile. The article praised him as a pillar of the community, highlighting his tireless dedication to the town's economic prosperity and his mentorship of young workers. The piece mentioned how Henderson Textiles had thrived under his leadership, how he'd brought in new contracts, modernized operations, and maintained the highest standards of workplace ethics and employee relations. I ran to the bathroom and vomited. Not only had he escaped any consequences, but he had prospered. He was being celebrated while we were living in hiding, haunted by constant fear, buried under false names and invented histories. The discovery shook all of us to the core. For the first time since our escape, we began to question whether we had made the right decision by fleeing. Had our silence allowed him to continue abusing other women? How many others had suffered because we'd run instead of fought? From that moment on, Betty became more withdrawn and quiet. When I asked her what was wrong, she replied cryptically, "I'm thinking about the future, Linda. What happens when we're too old to work? What happens when one of us gets sick and needs real medical care with our real names and histories? We can't hide forever." In 1997, Betty fell ill. At first, we thought it was just a bad flu, but her health deteriorated rapidly despite our home remedies and over-the-counter medicines. Finally, when she couldn't get out of bed, we had no choice but to take her to the hospital. The doctor diagnosed her with pneumonia and admitted her immediately. In the third week of hospitalization, when we were alone in her room, Betty revealed a truth she'd been hiding. "It's not just pneumonia, Linda," she whispered, her voice weak. "It's lung cancer, advanced stage. They found it on the x-rays. I've probably had it for months, maybe longer." The news devastated me. Betty was our leader, our rock, the one who'd kept us together and kept us strong all these years. What she asked me to do next would haunt me for the rest of my life. On what turned out to be her last evening, Betty grabbed my hand with surprising strength. "Linda, Margaret, you must promise me something," she pleaded, using my real name for the first time in years. "Anything," I said, tears streaming down my face. "Promise me that one day the truth about what happened in Millbrook will come out. We can't let that monster continue to live as if he were a saint. We can't let what he did to us and probably to others stay buried forever." But Betty, doubt tormented me. Who would believe us now after so much time after we ran? After we've been living under false identities. With a weak voice, she murmured, "It's not time yet, I know that, but someday, Margaret, someday when it's safe, when you won't be destroyed by telling the truth. Promise me you'll find a way." "I promise," I whispered, my voice breaking. Betty Catherine Morrison, according to her hospital bracelet, passed away 2 weeks later. She was buried in a small cemetery on the outskirts of Charlotte in a modest and quiet funeral attended only by her 3 cousins and a few coworkers from the factory who barely knew her. The loss of our leader was devastating. The following years were a blur of grief, work, and slow adjustment to being 3 instead of 5. Emily Linda from our old life found some happiness when she met and married Carlos Rodriguez, a kind man who worked maintenance at the factory. She moved into her own small house nearby, starting a family of her own. She had 2 beautiful children who called me Aunt Linda and knew nothing of their mother's real past. Carmen and I continued to live together, 2 middle-aged single women devoted to their work, occasionally visiting churches in distant cities on weekends, searching for the familiar piece of worship without the danger of questions about our backgrounds. On one of these trips to a small church an hour away, Carmen confessed quietly, "Sometimes I wonder if God has forgiven us for living these lies all these years." "Do you think we need forgiveness for protecting ourselves from an abuser?" I replied. "Not for that," Carmen clarified, staring at the stained glass windows, "but for never trying again, for never reporting him again, even anonymously, for letting him hurt others because we were too scared to speak up." Her words cut deep because I'd been thinking the same thing. I realized Carmen still yearned for redemption, for a way to make peace with what we'd done and hadn't done. Her heart ached with the weight of our silence. Just 2 years after Betty's death, that same burden began to literally break Carmen's heart. She was diagnosed with a chronic heart condition, stress-induced cardiomyopathy, the doctor said. "Your heart is worn out," he told her bluntly, "like you've been living under extreme stress for years." She lived with the condition for several years, medication keeping her stable. But in 2003, she also passed away, slipping away peacefully in her sleep one autumn night. So only Emily and I remained, 2 survivors out of 5, 2 women carrying a secret that grew heavier with each passing year. Emily had built a real life as Emily Rodriguez. She had a husband who adored her, 2 children who were her world, a modest but happy home. She rarely spoke of the past, and I understood why. She'd been so young when it happened, so traumatized. She deserved her peace. For a few years, I continued to live alone in Charlotte, working at the factory until it was sold to a larger corporation in 2005. At 51 years old, I decided it was time for a change. I moved to a small town in the foothills of North Carolina, bought a modest house with my savings, and opened a small alteration and sewing shop. It was honest work, working for myself, and the town was small enough that people didn't ask too many questions about where you came from. Emily and her family visited several times a year. Watching her children grow up, my niece and nephew, who would never know the truth, brought me both joy and profound sadness. As I aged and the years accumulated, the promise I had made to Betty weighed more and more heavily on my conscience. The truth about Millbrook, about Whitmore, about what had happened to 5 women, could not die with me. But how could I fulfill that promise without endangering Emily's carefully constructed life? How could I reveal the truth after nearly 30 years with nothing more than my word against his continued success? The answer would come from the most unexpected place. In 2007, at age 53, I was reading the local paper when a small article caught my attention. Millbrook Textile Factory to close after 80 years, the headline read. Henderson Textiles, the place where it had all happened, was shutting down, a victim of overseas competition and changing markets. The article mentioned that a memorial was being planned to honor the factory's role in the community, and former workers were invited to share their memories and stories for a historical archive being created by the town library. My hands shook as I read. Part of me felt satisfaction that the place was finally closing, but another part felt a desperate urgency. If there was ever going to be a time to tell the truth, it had to be before everyone who remembered those days was gone. But I was still afraid, terrified actually. Then, a month later, I received a phone call that would change everything. It was from a journalist named Sarah Mitchell, who was writing a feature story about the factory closing and had been given my name by someone at the North Carolina Garment Workers Union. Is this Linda Peterson? She asked. My heart stopped. Yes, I managed to say. I understand you worked in textiles for many years. I'm collecting stories from former textile workers across the region for a larger piece about the industry's decline. Would you be willing to share your experiences? I should have said no, I should have hung up, but something in her voice, genuine interest, compassion, made me hesitate. I did work in textiles, I said carefully. But it was a long time ago. That's exactly what I'm interested in, she said warmly. The human stories, what it was really like, especially for women workers. So many stories from that era have been lost. We talked for over an hour. I told her about working conditions, about the challenges women faced, about workplace harassment, speaking in generalities, nothing specific about Millbrook. But she was sharp, perceptive. She sensed there was a bigger story I wasn't telling. At the end of the call, she said something that made my breath catch. Miss Peterson, I get the feeling there's something more you want to say but can't. If you ever feel ready to tell the whole story, whatever it is, my job isn't just to write articles. It's to give voice to people who have been silenced. You have my number. After she hung up, I sat there for a long time, staring at the phone. Was this the sign I'd been waiting for? Was this how the truth could finally come out? I called Emily that night. I need to talk to you about something important, I said. When she arrived the next day, I told her about the journalist, about the Millbrook factory closing, about the promise I'd made to Betty years ago. No, Emily said immediately, her face going pale. Absolutely not. My children are in high school now. My husband doesn't know anything about my past. I've built a life here. You can't destroy it. I won't mention you, I promised. I'll say there were only 4 of us. I'll leave you completely out of it. But they'll find out, she said, panicking. They'll investigate, they'll dig up old records, they'll connect me to you. Please, Margaret, Linda. Please don't do this. I had to choose between honoring my promise and protecting the only family I had left. I held her hands. I won't do anything until you're ready, I promise you that, but Emily, we're getting older. Whitmore is still out there. If we don't speak up before we die, the truth dies with us, and Betty and Ruth and Carmen will have suffered for nothing. She cried for a long time in my arms. Finally, she whispered, just give me time. Let me prepare my family, figure out how to tell them. Please just give me a little more time. I gave her that time, 2 more years, 2 years during which I continued to build my courage, to prepare myself, to gather what little documentation I still had from those days. And then in 2009, Emily called me with news that changed everything. I told them, she said, her voice shaking. I told Carlos and the kids everything, about Millbrook, about Whitmore, about who I really am, and they still love me, they understand why we ran. Carlos said he's proud of my courage, and the kids said I'm their hero. I wept with relief. Does this mean? It means I'm ready, she said. I'm ready to tell the truth with you together. The way we always did things together. In 2010, 31 years after our escape, Emily and I contacted Sarah Mitchell, the journalist, and told her we were ready to tell our story. We met her at a coffee shop halfway between our 2 towns. For 6 hours, we told her everything: the abuse, the failed attempt to report it, the desperate escape, the decades of hiding, the friends we'd lost along the way. Sarah listened with tears streaming down her face, taking notes, recording with our permission. When we finished, she said, "This story needs to be told, but I want to make sure you're both protected. Let me do some investigating first, see what I can find out about Whitmore, see if there are other women who have come forward over the years." What she discovered shocked us. There had been other complaints against Whitmore over the years, at least 3 that had been filed with the company but never went anywhere. 2 other women had quit suddenly under mysterious circumstances. And he'd been quietly moved to a different position in the company 5 years earlier after an incident with a young office worker that had been settled with a confidential payout. The pattern was undeniable. We weren't his only victims. Armed with this information, Sarah convinced 2 of the other women to speak on record. Suddenly, our story had corroboration, evidence, a pattern that couldn't be dismissed. The article ran in 2010 in a major regional newspaper. "The Women Who Disappeared, a 30-year cover-up of workplace abuse," was the headline. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The story was picked up by other papers, by radio stations, by television news. Emily and I were interviewed, photographed, suddenly thrust into a spotlight we'd spent 3 decades avoiding. Whitmore, now 68 and retired, denied everything. He called us liars, attention seekers, claimed we'd fabricated the whole story. His lawyers threatened to sue for defamation. But then more women came forward. Women who'd worked at Henderson over the years, women from other factories Whitmore had worked at before coming to Millbrook, women who'd been silenced by fear and shame and the belief that no one would believe them. The weight of evidence became undeniable. An investigation was opened. Company records were subpoenaed. Old complaints that had been buried were unearthed. The legal process took 2 years. Whitmore fought every step of the way, but the evidence was overwhelming. In the end, facing a mountain of testimony and documentation, his lawyers advised him to settle. There would be no criminal trial. Too much time had passed. Statutes of limitations had expired. But there was a civil settlement, a public apology from the company, and most importantly, an acknowledgement of the truth. Henderson Textiles' parent corporation issued a formal statement admitting that they had failed to protect their employees, that complaints had been mishandled, that women had been silenced and forced out rather than protected. Whitmore's name was removed from a community service award that had been named after him. The company scholarship fund he'd established was renamed. His reputation, the thing he'd protected for so long at our expense, was finally destroyed. He never apologized personally, never admitted what he'd done. He died in 2015, bitter and isolated, insisting to the end that he'd been the victim of a conspiracy. I didn't feel joy when I heard of his death. Just a sense of closure, of a chapter finally ending. With the settlement money we received, Emily and I decided to do something meaningful. We established the Henderson Survivors Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping women escape workplace abuse and rebuild their lives. We bought the old boarding house where we'd lived in Millbrook. It had been abandoned for years, and renovated it into a shelter and resource center. We hired counselors, lawyers, job trainers. We created a safe place for women to land when they had nowhere else to go. The work gave purpose to our suffering. Every woman we helped felt like a small redemption for the years we'd spent in hiding, for the silence that had allowed Whitmore to hurt others. Emily worked with the younger women especially, sharing her own story of trauma and recovery, showing them that it was possible to build a happy life even after the darkest experiences. I focused on the older women, those who felt it was too late for them, who thought they were too broken to start over. I understood them because I'd been there. Over the next 15 years, we helped hundreds of women. Some stayed a few weeks, some a few months. Some went on to successful careers, some simply found peace. All of them left knowing they weren't alone, that what happened to them wasn't their fault, that they deserved better. Our pain had been transformed into purpose. Today, at 70 years old, I sit in the garden of the Henderson Survivors Foundation headquarters, the old boarding house where 5 frightened women once plotted their escape. I look at the memorial we installed 5 years ago, 5 benches arranged in a circle, each with a plaque bearing the real names of the women who fled that night in 1979. Ruth Martinez, Betty Chen, Carmen Santos, Linda Thompson, and Margaret Hayes. Our real names, finally spoken aloud after decades of silence. The names we were born with, the names we should have been able to live under with dignity and pride. Emily visits often with her grandchildren now. She's told them the whole story, age-appropriate versions for the younger ones, the full truth for the older ones. They call the foundation Grandma's House and volunteer here during summers. Sometimes when I walk through these halls, past the rooms where women are rebuilding their lives, I feel the presence of Ruth, Betty, and Carmen. I can almost hear Carmen's laugh, Betty's confident voice offering solutions, feel Ruth's gentle guidance. And I know with a certainty that transcends logic that they are at peace, that our suffering was not in vain, that our escape, our silence, our eventual truth telling, all of it mattered. We changed things. Not just for ourselves, but for the hundreds of women who have passed through these doors, and for countless others who have heard our story and found the courage to speak their own truths. Looking back on this journey, the lessons I've learned are profound. Perhaps the most important concerns the nature of true courage. When I was young, I thought courage meant following rules, respecting authority, never making waves. But real courage is knowing when to break the rules that protect abusers. Real courage is trusting your own instincts even when everyone around you says you're wrong. Real courage is running when staying would destroy you and speaking up when silence protects evil. I've also learned about the insidious nature of abuse and how it spreads in silence. Whitmore wasn't some obvious monster. He was a respected manager, well-connected, professional. He abused his power because the system allowed it, because victims were silenced, because witnesses looked away, and because institutions protected their own reputations over truth. That's why I tell every woman who comes through our doors. Your voice is your power, use it even if it shakes. Even if at first it's only a whisper, do not be silent. Silence only protects abusers, never victims. The power of community has been another profound lesson. Alone, none of us would have survived. Together, we found strength. It was through the generosity of strangers like Tom and Jake that we were able to escape and rebuild. It was through supporting each other that we endured the dark years. And it was through building a new community of survivors that we found purpose and healing. No one overcomes trauma alone. No one heals in isolation. We need each other desperately, and there is no shame in that need. Finally, I've learned about forgiveness, not the cheap kind that's demanded of victims to make others comfortable, but the real kind that comes slowly, painfully, in its own time. I had to forgive myself for not being able to stop Whitmore sooner, for running instead of fighting, for the years of silence. I had to forgive the system that failed us, not to excuse it, but to free myself from the rage that was consuming me from the inside. And in a strange way, I had to make peace with the journey itself, with all its pain and loss, because that journey made me who I am today and gave me the purpose I now live for. Dear friends, thank you for walking with me through this story, one of silence turned to strength and of a betrayal that refused to be forgotten. If this tale touched your heart even just a little, please don't let it stop here. Subscribe to Grandma Life Stories for more voices from the quiet corners, more truths the world tried to overlook. So subscribe and share your experience in the comments below. Take care.